The Pacific region accounts for a huge part of the Earth's surface, of its population, and of the global economy. It is therefore, as we've heard, a cauldron of contradictions, of class and national struggles. Many of them have been touched on today, and they include, in a far from exhaustive list, the struggles of the First Nations and their peoples in the settler colonial states of Australia and New Zealand, of the native or indigenous Alaskans and Aleutian Islanders, the struggles of the small island nations of the South Pacific against the existential threat of climate change, against the bitter legacy of nuclear testing by the imperialist powers, and for a nuclear-free zone of peace, for the right to pursue an independent diplomacy, as we see recently in Solomon Islands, and for development against poverty, the national democratic struggle in the Philippines, the anti-colonial struggles of the peoples of New Caledonia, or more correctly, Kanaki, Hawaii, Guam, home of the Chamorro people, Okinawa, or more correctly, Luchu, and others, the struggle against the revival of Japanese militarism, and so on. Besides China, another socialist country in the region, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, stands in direct and acute confrontation with US-led imperialism, while the Korean people as a whole struggle for the reunification of their country, and militant struggles are waged by the combative South Korean working class, as we heard brilliantly outlined by Ju Hyun and other speakers today. However, it is the ever more undisguised hostility of imperialism, US imperialism in particular, towards the People's Republic of China, that, along with the situation regarding Ukraine, increasingly constitutes the principal issue in world politics, the main contradiction around which all the other contradictions pivot and which it increasingly impacts upon. As Mao Zedong said, grasp the key link and everything else falls into place. The contradiction between US imperialism and the Chinese Revolution, as we've heard, has a long history. The United States, as outlined in particular by Ken right at the start of the meeting, joined in the neo-colonial degradation and exploitation of China by all the major imperialist and colonial powers that began in earnest with the First British Opium War of 1840. However, unlike such powers as Britain, Japan, Tsarist Russia, and Germany, it didn't manage to help itself to its own slice of Chinese territory. It therefore sought other ways to expand into China at the expense of its imperial rivals, but of course, above all, at the expense of the Chinese people. At home, anti-Chinese racism, as expressed, for example, in the Chinese Exclusion Act, became another pillar of US white supremacism. It was therefore natural that in the epic class struggle waged under the leadership of the Communist Party of China against the Chiang Kai-shek regime, US imperialism would do its utmost to prevent the victory of the Chinese People's Revolution. Although this was not without opposition at home, not just from the progressive forces, but also for a time in the context of the anti-fascist war, even from a section of the US ruling class, those who served in the Dixie Mission, the US wartime delegation to the communist base in Yan'an, not least John S. Service, drew certain conclusions from their time in China. That Chiang Kai-shek's regime was excessively brutal and hopelessly corrupt, that the communists were clean and honest and had the people's support, that they were not simply so-called puppets of Moscow. Rather, the Chinese Communist project was essentially one of nation building. As a result, the cry of "Who lost China?" became one of the key building blocks of the McCarthy era, the period of white terror in the US, not only against communism, but also against anyone or anything even mildly progressive. In this atmosphere, for decades, the United States not only persisted in the ridiculous fiction that the defeated remnants who had retreated to the island of Taiwan remained the lawful government of China. From China's entry into the Korean War in October 1950, the US placed a total embargo and blockade on the People's Republic. For the next 2 decades, literally just a handful of US citizens were able to set foot in the People's Republic, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and Edgar Snow being 2 key exceptions. The US threatened to use nuclear weapons against China on a number of occasions during the Korean War and during the 1958 crisis in the Taiwan Straits. Not only the Korean War, but the Vietnam War too, resulted in large part from the US determination to roll back the Chinese Revolution and what it saw as its contagious example. The visit to China by US President Richard Nixon, himself a key protagonist in the McCarthy witch hunts 50 years ago, in February 1972, was therefore a sensational event, which, whatever else it might have been, represented a massive defeat for US imperialism's efforts to isolate and contain the People's Republic. As the Korean revolutionary leader Kim Il-sung observed at the time, Nixon went to Beijing not as a victor, but waving a white flag of surrender. Of course, Nixon and Kissinger hoped, by means of their opening to China, to perpetuate and exacerbate the damaging division between the two major non-capitalist powers of the time, the USSR and the PRC. Their simultaneous pursuit of détente with Moscow, incidentally, was also designed to serve the same purpose. However, Nixon and Kissinger also had some appreciation of the potential opportunities of the Chinese market. They had also concluded that the US war in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia was strategically lost, but they sought some sort of face-saving exit, and one that might ensure that a communist victory in Indochina did not precipitate further successful revolutions in Southeast Asia. Nixon himself had already hinted at this in a 1967 article in Foreign Affairs, the House Journal of the US Foreign Policy Establishment, an article that had been more carefully noted in China than it had been in the US. There have always been and remain many deep and fundamental issues between the United States and People's China, but none of them can compare in importance to that of Taiwan. That is why it took from Nixon's visit in February 1972 to January 1st, 1979, for the two countries to formally establish diplomatic relations. On the final day of Nixon's visit, the two sides released the Shanghai Communique, the first of three key communiques that define the very basis of US-China relations. This communique stated, the US acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. It continued, with this prospect in mind, it affirms the ultimate objective of the withdrawal of all US forces and military installations from Taiwan. The second communique was issued marking the establishment of diplomatic relations and noted, the US recognizes the government of the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. Within this context, the people of the US will maintain cultural, commercial, and other unofficial relations with Taiwan. The third communique, issued in August 1982, stated, the US government attaches great importance to its relations with China and reiterates that it has no intention of infringing on Chinese sovereignty and territorial integrity, or interfering in China's internal affairs, or pursuing a policy of two Chinas, or one China, one Taiwan. Of course, these communiques all contain compromises, contradictions, and caveats, nor can it be said that the United States has observed them in particularly good faith. To imagine they might have done would surely indicate considerable ignorance and naivety with regard to the history of US behavior, whether at home or abroad. Nevertheless, they represent the very bedrock of relations between China and the US. That is why the process of systematically violating and dismantling the commitments they contain, a process begun in earnest under the last administration of Donald Trump and now being escalated to an alarming extent by Joseph Biden, has created such a dangerous and explosive situation. In August, we saw the visit to Taiwan of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, constitutionally the second in line to the US presidency, who flew in on a military aircraft with an air and sea armada in tow. The Taiwan Policy Act, currently making its way through the US legislature, would re-establish a permanent US military base presence on the island for the first time since 1979. And no less than 4 times now, Biden has asserted that the US would commit military forces to support the Taiwan authorities in the event of a military conflict. Each time, Biden has claimed that is a commitment that the US has made, although that is flatly not the case. In his most recent such outburst, just a few days ago, he stated that US support for the separatist forces in Taiwan would go even beyond the massive backing currently being given to Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. Administration officials have repeatedly tried to walk back from Biden's comments, claiming in the face of clear evidence to the contrary that US policy has not changed. Now, it is eminently believable that Biden might have difficulty in remembering his wife's name when he wakes up in the morning. However, to ascribe 4 outbursts in almost exactly the same terms to an old man's foolishness surely strains even the most credulous. One might recall here the sardonic observation of the 19th century Irish poet and playwright Oscar Wilde: to lose one parent may be regarded as a misfortune, to lose both looks like carelessness. It is the calculated provocations of both main political parties of the US imperialist ruling class that have reduced relations between China and the major imperialist powers to their lowest and most dangerous level in more than half a century. The situation in Europe today is a sobering reminder that wars between the major powers, between nuclear powers, are by no means inconceivable. This is the serious background to our meeting today. The times demand the broadest possible unity between all those who, irrespective of their ideology, beliefs, or views on other matters, recognize that a conflict between China and the United States will be a catastrophe for the whole of humanity. That if we are to avoid climate catastrophe and tackle other such existential threats to humanity as pandemics, we need to pursue cooperation, not confrontation. Friends of Socialist China thanks you again for your support and looks forward to working with you in pursuit of these objectives.